All right. How are y'all doing? This is strange. I can't see you respond to me. So just respond to your cats or whoever you're sitting with in your rooms. But I see there's a good group of folks here, and I'm super excited. You can hear my dogs in the background, so we're all here. I am Karma Chávez. Many of you already know me, but I'm the chair of the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies. And I'm also going to be one of our presenters today, but I decided, given my role in GRIDS, that I would go ahead and do the introduction to this event as well, and then kind of let you know what we're going to do for the day. And so I wanted to start off by talking to you all a little bit about what GRIDS is. GRIDS refers to the Gender, Race, Indigeneity, Disability, and Sexuality Studies Initiative. This is a project of the College of Liberal Arts Diversity Committee at the University of Texas at Austin. We began this project a couple of years ago, and it's designed to foster relationships and coalitions and connections among those who do gender, race, indigeneity, disability, and sexuality studies across the University of Texas. And so we've done a few projects, many of which were sort of stunted by the COVID-19 pandemic, as so many things have been. But probably the biggest thing we've done that we're proud of is last year we ran a major cohort hire search in the College of Liberal Arts, which resulted in the hiring of 7 new tenured or tenure track faculty across the college who are part of this project. This spring, we're doing a series of events, about one every month, that bring together our different partners. And the partners represented in GRIDS include the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies, the Center for Mexican American Studies, Department of African and African Diaspora Studies, the Warfield Center for African and African American Studies, Center for Asian American Studies, the Program in Native American and Indigenous Studies, the Center for Women's and Gender Studies, as well as the Program in LGBTQ Studies. I think I got all the partners there. And so we're very grateful to all of our partners who've helped to put this on, particularly for this event. The Department of Mexican American Latino Studies, especially our communications team, Mallory and Ashley and Alex, who've helped to put a lot of this together, as well as the staff in the Center for Women's and Gender Studies and the Program in LGBTQ Studies. Particularly grateful to Grayson Hunt, who's the Associate Director of the LGBTQ Studies Program and who's going to moderate the Q&A today. So very grateful to all of our partners. I also wanted to encourage you throughout the talk today to go ahead and put questions using the Q&A function, which you'll see down at the bottom of your screen. On mine, it's on the bottom, I guess that would be the bottom right. If I always get stage left and right confused here. But feel free at any point to put the questions up, and after Eithne and I do our presentation, then we will begin responding to those, and Grayson will help us do that. So I'm going to introduce Eithne and tell you just briefly what our plan is for today. So my lovely colleague, Eithne Luibhéid, some of you will recognize because she was a research fellow in the Latino Research Institute during the 18-19 academic year, I believe it was. Is that correct, Eithne? Eithne is a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Arizona. She's also what many of us in the field would consider the foundational, one of the 2 or 3 foundational thinkers in the area of queer migration studies. She's perhaps most well known for her book Entry Denied, which was published in 2002, which you cannot teach a queer migration class without referring to that book. And she's also author of the 2013 book Pregnant on Arrival. And then we have our edited book, Queer and Trans Migrations, which is the subject of today's conversation and which came out last fall. So what we're going to do today here is we're going to give you just a little introduction to the book, and then each of us is going to read an excerpt from our own contribution to the book, and then we're going to open it up to you. And so with that, Eithne, you kick us off on this original introduction. So I'm going to pass it on to you.
Thank you, Karma, for your very generous introduction, and thank you to, I'm unmuted, right? You can hear me, folks? Okay, technology, good Lord. So thanks to everybody for being here, and all the co-sponsors, and to Karma for just being an amazing collaborator and person with whom to work and over many, many years. That is a rare thing, and you absolutely have to also read Karma's books. I thought she would introduce herself, but she's so modest she didn't. So please go check that bio and read her books. Today, we're going to tell you a little about what prompted us to create the collection Queer and Trans Migrations, Dynamics of Illegalization, Detention, and Deportation. And that had to do both with the political and historical moment that we're in and where scholarship and public discussion are at. We'll talk a little about why we thought it was important to have academics, activists, and artists together, and about the kind of work that we hope the book can inspire. And as Karma said, we will then share short excerpts from our individual chapters.
So we decided to work on the book after we co-organized a conference on queer migration in 2014, which just happened right before the so-called child migrant crisis that summer. We envisioned the book as a companion to Eithne's earlier co-edited volume, Queer Migration, Sexuality, US Citizenship, and Border Crossing, which centered queer of color migrants and communities and questions of border crossing and citizenship. My book, Queer Migration Politics, was also in print and widely circulating, as was a growing body of work in transmigration studies. So it seemed like the right moment to broaden queer and trans migration conversations to take up increasingly urgent issues of criminalization, detention, and deportation. We put out a call for papers for the book in 2017, as everyone was living with the dire effects of the newest rounds of racial capitalism, colonialism, settler colonialism, and state terror, all of them working through normative gender and sexuality logics.
Under those logics, untold millions of people around the world are being forced into migration. And yet countries like the United States that play key roles in generating migration, including through invasion, warfare, colonization, unjust trade and economic policies, and policies that fuel the climate crisis, just to mention some of the major issues, are not addressing their role in generating migration, but instead, as we know, they've been slamming their doors, building walls, and criminalizing migrants. We know that that kind of response has routed untold numbers of people into situations where they risk their safety and their lives. They are unable to access legal status, and they live under conditions of exploitation while being ineligible for the most basic assistance or care, and remain vulnerable to separation from family or friends at any time through deportation. And we also know documented migrants are increasingly criminalized and routed into detention and deportation, and that people seeking asylum are criminalized, penned up or driven out, and subject to extraordinary levels of violence, terror, and abandonment. We also know these logics and practices both stem from and continually legitimize settler colonial, racist, heterosexist, transphobic, and anti-poor policies and practices toward US citizens. Further contributing to the current situation, there have been extraordinary levels of state and private investment in walls, cages, and surveillance, in cruelty, brutality, unaccountability, and state and corporate lawlessness, even while basic collective goods and services, including food, shelter, healthcare, and education, are rolled back. And people, both migrant and citizen, are experiencing what Elizabeth Povinelli calls economies of abandonment and dispossession, and that the pandemic has deepened these dynamics and the suffering. Media and politicians, whether Republican or Democrat, tend to frame migrants and marginalized US communities as somehow causing the crisis. The contributors to this book flip the script and call out the carceral nation state, corporations, and white supremacist, anti-Black, settler colonial, and patriarchal logics and practice as the source of crisis and as needing to be transformed or abolished.
I'm going to share my screen real quick at this point, because what I want to do is show you briefly here. What you see up on the screen there is actually the table of contents of the book. So you can take a look at this while I tell you a little bit about what we think the book does. So all of the contributions help us to analyze and understand the current structures of power that are creating these conditions of dispossession and suffering. Help us make links among struggles so we can understand how the illegalization, detention, and deportation of queer and trans migrants connects with the movement for Black lives, feminist politics, and prison abolition. And they make connections among struggles at different scales, from the most local to the global. For nation state migration, detention, deportation, and security regimes draw from and cite one another to legitimate their actions, just like capitalism creates the scripts for countries and corporations alike to draw and exploit migrant labor and Black, Native, Brown, female, poor, queer, and trans labor, profiting at every step. Contributors to this book also document extraordinary histories of refusal, resistance, and dreaming and working toward a different world that is not just about surviving, but thriving, starting not with rich white men, but with communities that have faced most harm under the current system. And these contributions remind us that we all have a part to play in making change, which varies depending upon your circumstances, but everything counts, everything matters, and every effort helps.
In the book, we use the concepts of queer and trans in a double sense. They're used both as identity categories and analytic rubrics. As identity categories, the terms queer and trans, like the term lesbian, gay, bisexual, heterosexual, cisgender, transformista, loca, bakla, and many related terms, require scholars and activists to navigate complicated political, ethical, and theoretical mandates. And this is because there is nothing essential, universal, timeless, or unchanging about those terms. They have emerged through and remain implicated in histories and geographies of power. They involve self-attribution and attribution by others. They are tied to and uphold state regimes for making populations legible and governable. And they also offer compromised but important means for making claims. The essays navigate these complexities in ways that honor the experiences, vision, and work of people who self-identify as queer and trans migrants.
We also use queer and trans as analytic rubrics that may or may not refer to identities or identifications at all. My essay, which I'll talk about shortly, offers one example of how this works. Moreover, the book as a whole uses a queer studies framework. This is different from a lesbian and gay studies framework because it refuses the idea of that sexual, gender, or other identities are essential or transhistorical, and instead explores how the distinctions between normal versus abnormal sexualities and genders get created in the regimes of power and domination that are involved. A queer analysis makes clear that the processes for producing sexual and gender norms are inextricable from dynamics of capitalism, colonialism, settler colonialism, racialization, and nation formation. Queer analysis also commonly uses a heteronormativity framework, which we also use. Heteronormativity, which is not the same as heterosexuality, suggests that all societies are structured around sexual and intimate norms that are not everywhere and always the same, but generally normalize and privilege sexuality channeled into childbearing and male-female marriage among the dominant ethnic, racial, and class group. That norm produces a range of subaltern groups, including lesbians, gay men, and trans people, and also poor and racialized women who birth children, sex workers, and others who do not match up to or adhere to sexual and intimate norms. While our book centers queer and trans identified migrants and organizations, it is in conversation with migrant justice struggles of all sorts that are seen as linked in struggles against heteronormativity.
The book acknowledges and honors important changes we have seen over the last decade. And these include that queer and trans migrants are increasingly visible at the forefront of extraordinary social movements, organizing efforts, and cultural work that has redefined how we understand and work for migrant and queer justice. In 2007, Queers for Economic Justice released Queers and Immigration, a Vision Statement, which envisioned transforming the immigration system in ways that centered the priorities of queer and trans people and communities most harmed by the current policies. Since then, numerous activist, artist, and artivist groups have emerged. And in the United States, these include, but certainly are not limited to, the Trans-Latina Coalition, the Immigrant Youth Justice League, United We Dream, Culture Strike, which is now the Center for Cultural Power, the Queer Undocumented Immigrant Project, Mariposas Sin Fronteras, Familia, Trans Queer Liberation, Trans Queer Pueblo, the Queer Detainee Empowerment Project, the Black LGBTQ+ Migrant Project, and many, many others. If you read through the contributor biographies at the back of the book, you'll see the extraordinary array of social justice projects and organizations that they work with. All of these efforts have made important inroads into checking the gender and sexual normativity of the immigration movement, setting queer and trans-centered migration agendas, challenging the treatment of trans and queer migrants in detention, and much more. And this kind of work is also evident around the world with organizations like the Forcibly Displaced Peoples Network, the African LGBTQI+ Migrant Network, and Rainbow Refugee.
In creating the book, we didn't try to produce something that we claim as quote unquote representative, which would be impossible, but instead issued an open call that invited grounded, cutting edge work that helps us understand the moment we're in and how to move forward in transformative ways. Queer and trans migrations remains heavy on contributors from and research about the United States. This troubling overrepresentation reflects US power and hegemony in the production and circulation of academic knowledge. The book is not intended to suggest that US experiences are universal or generalizable, and contributors also engage processes of illegalization, detention, and deportation in Turkey, Greece, Canada, and Native nations.
Overall, the book came about because of the urgency of the current situation, the need to continue having conversations and taking action, and the importance of ensuring the work remains centered on racial, gender, sexual, economic, settler, colonial, and geopolitical justice that begins from the priorities of those most harmed by the current system. We can certainly be glad that Donald Trump did not get a second term and that President Biden has begun taking immediate action on immigration that will be helpful. And yet the Biden agenda is hardly radical, and he will face an uphill battle in making changes, as we've already seen. That means this work must continue in these difficult times, and yet the times are times of possibility. These are times where people are coming together and demanding big changes that were not part of public conversations even a few years ago. These include the demands to abolish ICE, abolish detention, abolish DHS, abolish the police, abolish prisons, abolish racial capitalism, let migrants stay, and rebuild communities to ensure not just survival, but well-being for everybody. The book documents some of these histories and some of the tools that have helped to get us to this point. I think of the book as a work of love and thanks and a call to keep going. And we did want to tell you all the royalties from the book will be donated to support the organization Mariposas Sin Fronteras, which has been doing this kind of work for several decades now. That's a little bit about the book as a whole. And as Karma said, we're now going to share a little from our individual chapters. So I will share first, it's about 10 minutes, then Karma's going to share, and then we'll open up for some conversation, which will be great. So I'm going to continue to read to you, if that's okay. So, and I'm going to open with the story. So in April 2014, current and formerly undocumented migrants released recommendations that urged President Obama to stop migrant deportations and undo laws and practices that pipelined as many as 400,000 people a year into deportation. That group described itself as a blue ribbon commission, and it included queer and trans-identified migrants. The recommendations came in response to President Obama's problematic call to make deportation, quote, more humane, using a consultative process that did not include undocumented immigrants or communities deeply affected by deportation. Typically, a Blue Ribbon Commission is comprised by, and I quote, exceptional people who are appointed to investigate, study, or analyze a given question. It's authority. Being on the commission signals that you are considered among the best and the brightest, and that your recommendations should be, quote, used by those with decision-making power. The move by undocumented and formerly undocumented migrants to constitute themselves as a Blue Ribbon Commission brilliantly appropriated these standard government strategies for addressing important issues. Although immigration law, backed by state violence, constructs undocumented people as neither present nor having a political voice, the Blue Ribbon Commission insisted that members' voices should be heard and recognized as expert, and their recommendations to dismantle the deportation pipeline should be taken seriously. I open my chapter with this story because the release of the Commission's recommendations reflects struggles and concerns that motivated both our collection and this chapter. The US has the largest detention and deportation system in the world, and my chapter tells the story of how did we get to this place. I tell it in a way that centers queer and trans migrants who are usually left out of scholarship. I explain where they fit into larger dynamics of migration, the policies through which people become undocumented, and the creative, innovative responses and challenges that they have implemented. My chapter first explains that US immigration controls reproduce and normalize a heteronormative US nation and citizenry. My approach treats migration controls not as kind of passively managing existing conditions, but as actively contributing to the production and normalization of deeply unequal social relationships. The chapter engages the vast scholarship about migration control as central to capitalist logic, settler colonialism, and racial formation, but expands it by drawing attention to gender and sexuality as axes of power and heteronormativity as organizing national norms and social relations, and showing that all this translates into immigration policies, including deportation. The chapter next engages the scholarship about how we understand living as an undocumented person. Mainstream media and public discourse suggest undocumented status reflects the supposedly, quote, undesirable character of individuals who have, quote, broken the law. This very individualizing and depoliticizing approach completely ignores the dynamics that drive global migration, the US role in these dynamics, and the way US migration policies route displaced people into undocumented status. Reframed in this way, we can think about being undocumented not as being about a type of person, but about being dispossessed and made exploitable through relations of power and knowledge that must be critically challenged. And what I add to the scholarship here is understanding of how sexuality and gender and heteronormative norms are central to the dynamics that leave people unable to access status. We know that rather than addressing conditions and dynamics that are routing millions into undocumented status, the US has instead expanded the criminalization of migration, militarized the borders, expanded the array of authorities who are involved in policing everyone's status, and massively expanded detention and deportation. And this was true not just under Trump, but since the 1980s under Democrats and Republicans alike. So the third section of the chapter talks about these general dynamics and about where queer and trans identified migrants fit in and what they experience. This section explores how sexual and gender logics, in their intersection with the economic dispossession, racialization, settler colonialism, and empire, shape who is targeted for detention and deportation. A heteronormativity framework is especially useful because, as Tanya Golash-Boza shows, Working class men from Latin America and the Caribbean are overwhelmingly targeted for deportation. Monisha Dasgupta suggests these men are targeted, quote, precisely because they do not and cannot structurally live up to gender and sexual norms that are prescribed by white settler heteronormativity. LGBTQ migrants, especially trans women, migrants of color from Latin America or the Caribbean, and or who are poor, are highly vulnerable to being targeted. While in detention, as we know, conditions are organized around and perpetuate sexualized, gendered, racialized, and economic violence and terror. And this has been thoroughly documented in innumerable reports about the cruel, abusive, neglectful, and literally life-threatening conditions in detention. Despite decades of documentation like this, ICE, Border Patrol, and DHS continue to operate with impunity and have instead expanded their capacity to detain. Queer and trans migrants who are positioned at the intersection of multiple identities, hierarchies, and movements that often either overlook them or else seek advancement at their expense have emerged as leaders and made significant interventions into the framing of demands and the tactics that are used to challenge detention, deportation, and the migration system as a whole. And Karma showed several images from some of those efforts that just show some of the framings and the strategies that have been used. This work makes connections to justice struggles that are being waged by subaltern citizens, including for economic redistribution, Black Lives to Matter, an end to mass incarceration, reproductive justice, trans and queer justice, environmental justice, and much more. Understanding that the struggles of migrants and subaltern citizens are thoroughly intertwined, queer and trans migrants create what Karma describes as, quote, coalitional moments that re-envision and reconstruct imaginaries of possibilities for radical social and political change. Protest against queer and trans detention has particularly sparked coalitional organizing. In 2011, a series of groundbreaking complaints were filed against the Department of Homeland Security on behalf of detained LGBT migrants. And in response, DHS created a special detention facility for transgender migrants that's called the LGBT pod, though now it only houses trans folks. And yet the abuse of LGBTQ detainees continued, leading to nationwide protests and congressional concern that continues to this day, including in 2020 when members of Congress wrote to demand that ICE either comply with its own guidelines for detention or release all detained trans people. In 2015, Geneset Gutierrez, an undocumented trans migrant from Mexico, interrupted President Obama at a White House event to protest the abuse of detained trans migrants and demand the release of LGBTQ detainees and all detainees. In 2016, undocumented trans and queer migrants bravely went on public strike to protest the LGBT pod and all immigrant detention. Queer and trans migrants have mobilized around the arrival of caravans of gay and trans Central American migrants seeking asylum in 2017 and 2018, and in numerous other struggles. And this is one of the images from the book taken at the border right after the 2017 caravan had crossed. These were two of the folks who crossed with the caravan. Struggles against migrant illegalization, detention, and deportation have deeply tangled roots that connect multiple forms of violence and freedom dreams. I wanted to describe these roots in ways that center queer and trans migrants as both targets of these systems and as leaders in envisioning and creating alternatives that connect to the freedom struggles everywhere. I believe understanding these entanglements offers resources, roadmaps, and inspiration for all of us as the struggle continues. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Karma, who will next share from her chapter.
Thank you, Eithne, and hopefully y'all are getting excited to take a look at the book. And just if you're not looking at the chat, I just wanted to mention that Susan Pulse from Bookwoman, our local bookstore, feminist bookstore here in Austin, there are copies of the book in her store. I was just there the other day picking some books up, and they are in fact there. And you can also get them by going to ebookwoman.com and get a copy of the book through local bookstore, which we absolutely want you to do. So I'm going to read just an excerpt from my chapter, and my chapter is a co-authored chapter with Hannah Masri, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow in global communication at the University of Pennsylvania and finished her PhD here at the University of Texas in communication studies, I guess, last spring. And so this is something that we wrote together. And so I'm just going to give you a little excerpt here. At the same time as the 2014 child migrant crisis covered the news, immigration rights organizations decried the separation of families, and Obama gave speeches around the country. He crafted shifts in immigration policy to increase penalties for smugglers, as well as to get appropriations for initiatives, including a border security surge, an aggressive deterrent strategy, and the resources to, quote, appropriately detain, process, and care for children and adults. Put simply, the political theater of this humanitarian crisis, which embraces the figure of the child, would be used toward punitive ends. More resources for Homeland Security, including border militarization, detention, and deportation systems. Despite this very conservative agenda, Congress refused to assist. But Obama did not have to wait for Congress. Via executive action, the Obama administration announced the discontinuance of the controversial Secure Communities, or SCOM program, on November 20th, 2014. US Citizenship and Immigration Services summarized the purpose and content of Obama's executive actions in the following way. They wrote, on November 20th, the president announced a series of executive actions to crack down on illegal immigration at the border, prioritize deporting felons, not families, and require certain undocumented immigrants to pass a criminal background check and pay taxes in order to temporarily stay in the US without fear of deportation. Now, news reports and immigrant rights organizations' press releases primarily centered their attention on this last action, the proposed extension of the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, to the undocumented parents of US citizens or legal permanent residents. Few emphasized the enforcement actions, specifically what Homeland Security Secretary at the time, Jay Johnson, introduced as PEP, or the Priority Enforcement Program. Unlike SCOM, under PEP, immigration officials would target only, quote, high priority groups, such as, quote, those who threaten national security, public safety, or border security, those convicted of 3 non-traffic misdemeanors, and those, quote, with other immigration violations. Arguably, these priority groups could expand to include nearly every deportable person, especially under the ambiguous purview of the third category. In the face of years of advocate and activist outrage that Obama's deportation practices divided hundreds of thousands of families by deporting nearly 3 million people since 2009, the administration's framing device, deporting, quote, felons, not families, clearly responded directly to established immigrant rights rhetoric. The catchphrase's responsive rhetoric is further obvious because the immigrant rights movement's pro-family rhetoric has often been paired with contentions that immigrants are not criminals. Felons, not families, thus mirrors the demands of the mainstream immigrant rights movement. In their framing, both Obama and the mainstream movement ignore families with felons, a significant problem since Black and brown immigrants in particular, like their citizen counterparts, are much more likely to have police encounters resulting in arrest and prosecution than white people. In suggesting that he heard the will of the people and changed course to deport felons, not families, in light of the quote unquote crisis of children on the border, Obama was able to continue to use family rhetoric not as a distraction from the material realities of his policies for families and non-families alike, but to justify those policies and to naturalize a particular kind of law-abiding family that the nation values. Now, numerous advocates celebrated Obama's November 2014 deferred action extension, but some queer migration activists lamented the extension's exclusions, focusing on who PEP targeted as deportable priorities. Such activists noted that the following groups were excluded from the deferred action order: These included parents of undocumented youth who benefited from the 2012 DACA, seasonal workers without connections to US citizen children, LGBT immigrants, especially youth and trans people who are more likely to have been homeless and therefore to have committed low-level criminal offenses, domestic violence survivors who can't get visas under the Violence Against Women Act, and Black immigrants who are more likely to be racially profiled by police and therefore either have a felony record or have family members who do. The Obama administration either did not acknowledge the family relationships of these groups as real or includable, or the administration failed to acknowledge how even, quote, real families might harm each other, creating conditions that put someone in a deportable position. For example, a young person flees domestic violence and commits theft in order to survive. Partners in the Not One More Deportation campaign, a campaign centrally organized by queer and trans migration activists that claimed a big role in pushing Obama to issue executive orders, also challenged Obama's felons not families framing, elaborating on some of the points mentioned above. Yesenia Valdez, a national organizer for Familia, Trans and Queer Liberation Movement, noted, quote, as a community, we know that we do not fit the normal definition of families that continue to dominate public discourse. Many LGBTQ undocumented immigrants do not have families that are US citizens or permanent residents that could allow them to qualify for the program. Additionally, we know that our community, especially trans women of color, is unfairly targeted by law enforcement through racial discrimination or for engaging in survival sex work. These daily realities mean that many members of our LGBT community will be left out of the president's plan. And Opal Tometi, the then executive director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration and co-founder of Black Lives Matter, a group that centers queer and trans perspectives, emphasized the point that law enforcement measures are always more impactful on Black people, and then added, we won't stand for a system that criminalizes us and then pits family against people who may have a criminal record. Tometi's comments also draw attention to the narrow definition of family prescribed in Obama's executive actions, as well as the damage done to numerous families by false divisions between alleged families and felons. Thus, the logics underlying Obama's response to the child migrant crisis, logics introduced by liberal immigration organizations, not only traffic in understandings that strengthen the very conditions that create child migrants in the first place, they also function to expand the categories of undesirable immigrants and to marginalize various communities of color. I could go on, but I think I'll leave it there, and then we can open it up to some questions. So once again, in the Q&A chat function there, you can feel free to put those in, and we'll get them answered. And Grayson, hi Grayson. Grayson is going to help to facilitate this. So it's great to see you.
Thank you, that was so great. Well, I know that I asked a question. I think because I switched over rooms, I can't see it that I typed it, but it is in the Q&A.
Oh, I can see it. Let me see it. So okay. I'll read it aloud. How's that?
Wonderful.
So Grayson Hunt says, I love the explanation about using queer and trans in two senses of the words as identities created through power and as an analytic rubric. Can you say a bit more about the trans analytic as it operates in this amazing new collection of essays? You want to start, Eithne?
Karma, feel free to start.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's interesting. I think both Eithne and I kind of identify as queer migration scholars. And as we were doing this work, we wanted to make sure that we didn't just tack trans on, so that wasn't an afterthought, and figuring out how to like deeply integrate the gendered analysis in here. And so we wanted to be really cautious not to reinscribe there's a lot of scholarship that has been called Transmigration Scholarship that uses migration as a metaphor to talk about the transition, the gender transition. And we want to sort of signal to that, but we also didn't want to reinforce that as a metaphor, because we feel like migration as a metaphor is damaging to migrants. And so I would say part of what we did was really just to integrate a deep gender analysis. And so heteronormativity is about sexuality, but it's about gender normativity, and thinking about the ways that trans migrants in particular complicate some of the ways that we've imagined asking for an LGBT inclusive migration. Things like binational same-sex couples, for example, which have been the historic kind of issue for queer migration. What does it mean when we're talking about non-cisgender partners? And so I think in some of those ways, it deeply informed kind of every piece of the analysis. And then of course, there's several pieces that are particularly about trans migrant identities, but Eithne probably has something more intelligent to say than I do.
I can't guarantee intelligent, but thanks, Karma, for starting us off. I guess what I would add to what Karma said was, you know, in some ways, Grayson, it was a very organic process, right? So we sent out the call, we saw what we got. I think I will speak for me, like to me, queer includes trans, but I'm aware of the important work that says, you know, queer often doesn't substantively engage trans scholarship and trans histories. And so we did discuss, should it be queer and trans migrations? Would that be the best way to call the collection? So we had that discussion at that point. But really, we sent out a call, we saw what came in. What came in included work by folks who self-identified as trans, and we just built on that. Like that's how people are framing, this is great, this is how we want to build it. And I think out of understanding trans, both like looking back through the official histories, like, you know, the special issues, the readers that discuss the term as an analytic and the work that it could do, and thinking about these contributions as both like perhaps informed by that, but also furthering those kinds of conversations. And in that sense, trans as an analytic rubric that is not foreclosed what it can do, but here folks were showing us some of what it could do that we really felt we wanted to highlight.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that sometimes when we use trans, it's just to, you know, send out a signal and find what we hear back, and to make space for those trans narratives. And I also love the point you said, Karma, about, you know, migration is not is not only, or it's not a metaphor, right? And when I'm thinking through with some indigenous scholars, right, colonization is not a metaphor. Like that's really important. And I've certainly heard at like trans studies conferences, you know, a few years ago, people would show up and they came thinking trans was a metaphor. So they were talking about like trans speciesism, which was not the right fit at a trans people conference, right? So I like the kind of specificity and having a politics behind how we use these terms. So if it's okay, or did you want to respond to that, Karma?
Well, you just made me think of something that I think is also relevant, which is the question of indigeneity. And so, you know, as Eithne said, like whenever you're putting together an edited volume, like for us, we sent out an open call. We didn't send out invitations. It's kind of like, who wants to contribute? And the things that we wanted to be very present in the volume were, one, we wanted it to be a transnational volume. Two, we wanted it to have trans voices centered in it. Three, we wanted Black voices centered in it. And four, we wanted indigeneity centered in it. And I don't know if the book succeeds on any of those fronts, which were all of our goals, but with indigeneity in particular, we were like, especially with a collection that focuses primarily on the US, how do you have a volume without an Indigenous scholar in it? And you know, it's like the classic, like we're gonna participate in this, you know, we were looking for people and they just didn't come kind of thing, right? Which is true and not true. And part of that's about the connections that we need to build, et cetera. But what we ended up doing on the question of indigeneity and coloniality is we did invite a roundtable discussion at the end of the book with a couple of Indigenous scholars and then folks who are doing works around coloniality. And that's where the book ends, and it's quite expansive, which was to make sure that that was front and center. I think you just made me think of that, which I think is a feature of the book that I think shows the complexity and also what we were trying to do.
And if I could just add one more thing onto that. You asked such a great question. You got us all going here. So Karma, to add on to what Karma described, like we did identify key priorities. What we asked all contributors to do was to grapple with key terms, right? Nobody take the terms for granted. You're using trans, you're using queer, whatever term you're using. We want the work to grapple with the histories, the complicated legacies of those words, the implications in power relations, but also the stuff people are able to do that is helpful with those terms, right? So it wasn't a binary approach, but I think, and Karma, you will say if you have a different perspective, you know, if people did that thoroughly, then we didn't feel it, like we don't get the final word, right? That would be a colonial approach to scholarship. We were open to what is the work being done? Is it thorough? Is it grappling? Is it making a contribution that we think is important and we think could be shared? And we got, I mean, so in that sense, the book for me was a learning process. And that's, to me, something I appreciate. And similarly, like the activist reflections, you know, some of the response we got from reviewers kind of sought to edit. And so Karma and I clarified, like, it isn't our place to edit, or like if somebody has made an argument that seems important to share, we're going to put it out there, right? So I think we also worked with the categories in that same way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we definitely had people. I mean, there's some of the, so, you know, the book features academics, artists, and activists. And so you'll find in the middle of the book, there's, I guess it's an 8-page full color display of the artwork. Some of it that we solicited, some of it that came in. Julio Salgado helped us to get art in, and he also did the cover for the book. And then the activists were mostly people that we knew, and we did kind of solicit a lot of those contributions as well. And some of them really disagree with each other. I mean, you can see disagreements on the pages, and some of what they say, I think some audiences are gonna not like at all. The piece by Yasmin Nair and the piece by Jose Herrera, I think people are gonna be pissed off about. And those are pieces that drew reviewer ire, and we were just like, yep, and these are two really, really important voices, and we're giving them the space that they want to say. But these are the kinds of negotiations you're trying to, you know, engage with in this sort of in this sort of project.
So you've got a comment coming in from Stacy. I'll read it aloud, and maybe you two can figure out who wants to answer first. Stacy says, I love this discussion about the trans analytic and what Grayson is asking about related to this complex aspect of what trans means in these contexts. I love this theoretical discussion. How do you see this playing out on the ground in real life, etc., for trans and queer migrants? How might these folks think about this idea of the trans analytic? Like the discussions about Latinx as more academic, US-based term versus how folks in everyday life use or don't use that term.
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. I think that's a great question. I mean, I would say in response to that, I think there's always a gap between the way that people are living a term and the way that academics are making meaning of it. And you definitely see that here too, although I think one of the things that we really wanted to try to do in this volume is to ensure that people that inhabited the positions of queer and trans migrant were at the forefront of driving the theoretical kind of thrust of what we're doing. And so in some ways, queer as an analytic and trans as an analytic in queer and trans migration studies, I think it's safe to say it extends from those subjectivities. And so, and not all those subjectivities, but I think people who are at the forefront of theorizing, so Bambi Salceda, who's in the volume, for example, and others. But Eithne, I'll turn it to you if you have anything else to add to that.
I also appreciate the question very much. Thank you. I guess my response is, I'm a very context-specific person, so I don't think, I never venture like a global answer, but I might say, okay, what are local organizations around you and how are they dealing with that? A different way I think about this is we highlight the double use of trans and queer as identity categories that have histories and implications in relations of power and as analytics, simply to make the point, to push back against this effort to always conflate those words with bodies and identities, but also open space for other things to be thought about. So that was the reason for the double focus. Third is, like, I am in a university, so I do think like an academic, but I also don't think I'm the only knowledge producer, right? So from my point of view, like when I hear and learn from organizations about what they are doing, like, could and should I use the word trans analytic? Like, perhaps I would, not as like I'm making a judgment, but as a way to make sense for me. And in saying that, what I'm saying is, like, I think that organizations are producing knowledge, and there are different ways we could name that. And I, as an academic, might use the fancy word analytic, but other folks could use other words. I hope that's a little bit helpful, but your question really is great and generates lots to think about.
So we have two more questions. Stacy says thank you, and we have questions from Elena and Edwin in the Q&A. So we can post these. I'll read them out loud and post them to the audience. The first one from Elena says, a bit of a basic question, but could you speak to your methods and your methodological choices for your pieces? Why were the chosen methods the best for your scholarship? Also, access, relationships, lack of archives, question mark, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually not a basic question. I think it should be a central question to us thinking about our scholarship. So thank you for that, Elena. And the truth is, it's a deeply, deeply interdisciplinary book. And so you'll see a whole range from historical analysis to ethnographic analysis to rhetorical analysis, media critique. It's very diverse. And what we wanted is for people to pick the way that they thought was best to answer questions related to illegalization, detention, and deportation. And so, you know, for me, I'm a rhetoric scholar by training, and so I'm always looking at how public discourse is circulating and shaping the way we think about things. And so I couldn't help but be sort of struck by some of these disconnects or contradictions, right, in the summer of 2014 around the uproar about these, you know, unaccompanied minors on the border. At the same time, Obama's all about this at the same time that he's creating policy that's actually creating those conditions. And so I thought analyzing public rhetoric would be an interesting way to show what's going on, right? So that's one example, but Eithne.
I always enjoy having conversations with audiences and Karma. Like, it feels like a dialogue, which is nice. So thanks, Karma, for starting off. And again, I'll just add further to that. I don't know how I ever even got a job. Do I have a method? I don't know. I'm not so sure, right? What is it? Like, all the humanities folks think I'm in social science, and the social scientists think I'm humanities. So I'm always baffled by methodologies to some extent. And yet, as Karma said, those are really critical questions. My story about this might be a little more like, you know, we sent out a call as broadly as possible and saw what came back. And so to some extent it reflects the networks and the circuits and we try to be as broad as possible. But when you look at this, you will see there's less humanities scholarship, though there's some. We also rejected some high-profile scholars because we actually didn't think their work was up to snuff, and we thought we had better work. So we were going for work of people who were serious, who were working with this, who made arguments that, like, we also wanted a book that can be broadly read. So whatever your method, explain it, give us an argument, make it accessible to everybody. And we read and edited everything several times. So some folks dropped out from exhaustion, right? But we really wanted a book in, like, for me, Bell Hook's work is a model of, like, just to write work that can be widely read. So we were also doing that. In terms of questions of archives and materials, this is something I always think about and I also write about. And a piece like the reflection by Suyapa Portillo Villada talks about, you know, she elicits testimonies from, she goes to immigration court to testify asylum cases, to conditions of harm in the countries from which people come. And so a piece like hers is actually raises lots important questions about the nature of that kind of testimony, how it becomes framed in legal ways, how it enters the archive, and how the entry in that way is because we need folks to get asylum. But when folks need asylum, you need to frame stories in particular ways. So she also speculates, like, on one hand, what her work creates is an archive of, in many cases, Honduran, but also Central American, perhaps more generally queer migrant stories that aren't normally, I don't want to use normally, are usually left out of the record. But she also at the same time talks about the nature of how these are collected and that it's for a court system, introduces lots of factors we have to think about. And that gets squarely to the questions of, like, what are the materials that are available? How do we gather them? And that they're never simple representations, but we need to think more deeply about conditions of their production and circulation. And I feel really so appreciative that lots of contributors took on those kinds of questions as part of their essay.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left and we have another question, which I've dropped into the chat. I'll read it aloud and then go from there. If the collection is US centric, how do these connections with Indigenous, Black, and other underrepresented contributors get built without tokenizing these authors? I guess what I'm asking is, how do we center their perspectives without generalizing entire populations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the bottom line is, this is a perennial question. And it deals with power and privilege in the academy. It deals with who gets access to these kinds of venues more broadly than just this project. And so I think we went in with a very intentional approach to center voices of people who are doing this work with an intention of ensuring that that represented a diversity of the folks who do this kind of work, and knowing that in this kinds of work, non-US folks, Indigenous folks, and Black folks are often marginalized. And so trying to make that a priority to center some of those perspectives, knowing that it can have the tokenizing function at the same time, but simply because something has that function doesn't mean that's its only function. And so I guess that's what I'd say, which is not a very satisfactory answer, but it's what I got, Eithne.
I would say that captures the dilemma. I mean, the structure of knowledge, the struggles we're up against, the effort we made, and the constant struggle that this involves.
Yeah.
Well, we're a minute out, so depending on whether our keynotes here have back-to-back meetings, we can thank everybody for being here and then maybe hold a after brief convo. There's one more convo in the chat, but again, I just want to honor everybody's time and thank everybody for being here. What do the speakers, the panelists say?
I don't have office hours for 30 more minutes, so
I can stay.
I can stay for the convo, sure.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for sticking around. So
But
the next
thank you
question.
to all the folks who have been here and need to leave. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we have people thanking you and showing love in the comments there. And then we have a question in the chat. It was just sent to the panelists, so I'm going to say it out loud here and maybe paste it into for everybody. Once the final version of the book was decided on, did you notice any striking differences in discourse around adults, meaning adults versus minors, academically or artistically?
I mean, I think it's in terms of, I'm not sure if the question means in terms of authorship or in terms of discourse circulating around migrants. I think so I'll answer it in the second way, and then if I'm wrong, Eithne could jump in, which would be to say, I think there's a way in which we imagine that the child is going to be a more sympathetic figure. And Eithne really pushed me and Hannah, or Hannah and I on this because, or Hannah and me on this because we, I think, bought into that idea for as we started to conceptualize this essay that the child migrant was a more sympathetic figure. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's true. I think maybe for a certain audience, but certainly not universally.
I also was not completely sure what the question meant. But if it was in this, and so feel free to clarify, but in the sense, if it is in the sense Karma talks about, I appreciate this question, Joe, because it really hits on some of the dilemmas, which is how do we make sympathetic appeals for change, right? And one of the ways is by speaking of children or particular figures who are often gendered as female and needing lots of help, cisgender. There's a range of figures, and so I think part of what Karma and Hannah's essay just demonstrates so amazingly is the ways those figures are used, the kinds of relations of power they reconsolidate, and the difficulties which we've also seen on the ground for migrant rights movements to figure out, like, how do you make appeals for change when it seems to demand you mobilize these figures, and yet they do reproduce the dilemmas. And we're seeing this starting all over again as Biden puts forward his agenda and his proposal to create a pathway to legal status, which I totally like. It's so time that to happen. And yet what we've seen is that ours is an excuse to line up millions of people to be criminalized and deported. And so it is that kind of perpetual dilemma of how do you make change, but not at the expense of recreating deserving, undeserving binaries. And so I think your question to me hits on a constant dilemma.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and thinking, yeah, trans minors in particular difficulties. Yeah, I mean, the trans migrants are never sympathetic figures unless it's around a campaign after they've already died in detention because of neglect or active abuse, and then all of a sudden, we rally around the trans migrant. So, yeah.
Can I also acknowledge, I see love from Erica Rand in the chat. Erica contributed enormously to the thinking and the production of the book and wrote us a beautiful blurb on the back. And we just want to send love and thanks to Erica Rand, who also helped to make this book possible.
It looks like we've come to the end. Karma, do you want to take us out?
Sure, I'm happy to. So this is not the last GRIDS event. Our next GRIDS event, I believe, is going to be on February 23rd, which is a Tuesday in the afternoon. And just keep an eye out for the details on that. Follow us at Latino Studies UT on any of the social media to get more information on the next event, as well as the ones in March and April. Thank you, Grayson. Thank you, Eithne. Thank you, Mallory. Thank you all so much. We'll see you.